Imagine standing in the dust of a dying town, watching the man you built a life with walk away with another woman on his arm, leaving you nothing but shame and a piece of paper that says you're no longer wanted. That's exactly where Marian Doyle found herself in 1882, abandoned in the unforgiving Arizona territory with $0, zero prospects, and a town full of people who'd already written her off. But sometimes, the worst betrayal leads to the greatest transformation. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Marian's journey travels. The morning Marian Doyle's world ended began like any other, with the merciless Arizona sun climbing over the Copper Creek Basin and the smell of coffee boiling on the stove. She stood at the kitchen window of the small homestead she'd spent 3 years turning into something resembling a home, watching dust devils spiral across the scrubland, unaware that in less than an hour, everything she'd known would be ripped away like a roof in a monsoon. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular creak of expensive springs, the rhythmic clip of well-bred horses, sounds that didn't belong in this part of the territory, where most folks rode mules or walked. Marian wiped her hands on her apron, a flutter of something she couldn't name stirring in her chest. Thomas had been gone for 3 weeks, supposedly handling business in Tucson. Maybe he'd done well. Maybe he'd bought something fine. The hope died the moment she saw the woman. She was porcelain perfect, sitting beside Thomas in a traveling dress of deep emerald that probably cost more than Marian's entire wardrobe. Dark ringlets framed a face that belonged in a daguerreotype, delicate and untouched by sun or struggle. The woman didn't look at Marian as the wagon pulled up. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. Thomas climbed down first, and Marian noticed with a sick lurch that he was wearing a new suit. His beard was trimmed in a style she'd never seen on him. He looked like a stranger wearing her husband's face. Marian. His voice was flat, businesslike. He didn't even have the decency to seem uncomfortable. Thomas. She descended the porch steps slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. You're back early. I wasn't expecting... This won't take long. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew 2 folded documents. The paper looked expensive, official. I've had these drawn up by a lawyer in Tucson. Everything's legal and proper. Marian stared at the papers in his outstretched hand, but didn't take them. What are those? Divorce papers. And a deed. He said it the way someone might announce they'd bought livestock. The homestead's yours, free and clear. I don't want it anymore. The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, like hearing a foreign language. What are you talking about? For the first time, something like impatience flickered across his face. I'm talking about the fact that this... He gestured vaguely at the homestead, at her, at the life they'd built, was a mistake. I'm correcting it. Behind him, the woman in emerald examined her gloved hands with studied disinterest, as if this scene were merely a tedious stop on a more important journey. A mistake. Marian repeated the words, testing them. They still didn't feel real. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of breaking this land, building this home, that's a mistake? Miss Genevieve and I are to be married in Santa Fe next month. Thomas's voice held the first trace of emotion, pride. Her father owns the largest mercantile operation in the New Mexico territory. He's offered me a partnership, a real future. Not this, again that dismissive gesture, hard scrabble existence. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Marian gripped the porch railing to steady herself. You're leaving me for her? For money? I'm leaving you for a better life, Thomas corrected, as if the distinction mattered. Genevieve is educated, refined. She's the kind of woman who can help a man rise in society. He trailed off, his gaze sweeping over Marian's work-worn dress, her sun-darkened hands, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. You're exactly what you've always been. The cruelty of it took her breath away. 3 years ago, Thomas Doyle had courted her with pretty words about building an empire together, about how her strength and determination were exactly what he needed in a wife. She'd believed him. She'd left her family's farm in Missouri, traveled across half the country, worked herself to exhaustion trying to make his dream real. And all along, she'd been nothing more than convenient labor, a placeholder until something better came along. Take the papers, Marian. Thomas thrust them at her again. You'll need to sign them in front of the territorial judge. I've already filed my intent. This is just a formality." A formality? Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow, distant. "Our marriage is a formality to you. Our marriage is over." He dropped the papers on the porch steps when she still didn't take them. "Sign them or don't. It makes no difference. I won't be back either way." That was when it truly hit her, the finality of it. He wasn't asking permission or seeking her understanding. He was simply informing her of a decision already made, a transaction already completed. She was being discarded like a worn-out tool. "Thomas," her voice broke on his name, "please, if you ever cared for me at all." "I did care." He cut her off, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "But caring isn't enough to build a real life on. You deserve honesty at least. This," he gestured between them, "was never going to be enough for me." He turned back to the wagon, offering his hand to the woman who'd replaced her. Genevieve took it with a graceful smile, allowing him to help her down as if she were made of spun glass. She was beautiful in a way Marion had never been and never would be. Delicate, ornamental, completely unsuited to the harsh reality of the frontier. And Thomas looked at her the way he'd never quite looked at Marion, even in their best moments. "The supplies in the back are yours," Thomas said, nodding toward several crates in the wagon bed. "Food, some household goods, enough to get you started, and the homestead's in good shape. You can sell it for a decent price if you're smart about it." "Sell it?" Marion's voice rose. "This is our home. It's your home now. Do what you want with it." He was already climbing back into the wagon. "I'm taking the horses except the old mare. She's yours too. You'll need something to get to town." Genevieve arranged her skirts delicately, still not looking at Marion. Her silence was its own form of cruelty. She couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge the woman whose life she was helping destroy. "Thomas, wait." Marion started down the steps, but the wagon was already moving. He didn't look back. Not once. She stood in the yard watching them disappear down the rutted trail toward town, dust rising behind them like a curtain falling on the final act of a play. The papers lay on the porch steps, their edges already curling in the heat. Somewhere nearby, a crow called out, harsh, mocking. The tears came then, hot and helpless. Marion sank down right there in the dirt, her carefully maintained composure crumbling like the adobe walls of the empty barn. 3 years. 3 years of her life, her work, her hope, reduced to 2 pieces of paper and a wagon full of supplies, as if that somehow made it fair. She didn't know how long she sat there. The sun climbed higher, baking the tears on her cheeks into salt tracks. Her body felt heavy, disconnected, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. Eventually she became aware of hoofbeats approaching, slow, unhurried. A rider emerged from the heat shimmer on the road, leading a pack horse. He was tall in the saddle, wearing the practical gear of someone who lived more outdoors than in. Worn leather vest, kerchief tied loosely around his neck, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. As he drew closer, Marion could make out more details. Dark hair shot through with gray, a face weathered by wind and work, eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He slowed as he approached, clearly having witnessed at least the tail end of the scene. For a moment, Marion considered fleeing into the house, unwilling to let a stranger see her shame. But pride required energy she didn't have, so she simply sat there, waiting for him to pass with the kind of carefully averted gaze most people offered to public misery. Instead, he stopped. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who'd spent time in Texas. "I don't mean to intrude on your grief, but are you injured? Do you need help?" The kindness in his tone nearly broke her again. Marion shook her head, not trusting her voice. The cowboy glanced down the road where Thomas's wagon had disappeared, then back at her. Something shifted in his expression, understanding maybe, or recognition of a particular kind of pain. He swung down from his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more life mounted than on foot. "Name's Elias Ward," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "I was passing through, saw what happened just now. That your husband who just rode off?" "Was." The word came out bitter. "Apparently, he's upgraded." Elias was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the papers on the porch, then to the homestead itself, taking in the neatly repaired fence, the vegetable garden showing signs of careful tending, the house with its fresh-patched roof. "You did all this work?" "Most of it." Marion wiped her face roughly. "Thomas was always better at ideas than execution. I was the one who—" Her voice caught. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters." Elias's tone was firm. "Work like this matters. A person who can build something out of nothing, that matters." Marion looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. His face held the kind of weathering that came from years of honest labor, and his eyes, though guarded, weren't unkind. He looked at her the way people looked at something valuable, not something discarded. "He left you for that painted china doll?" Elias shook his head slowly, something like disgust flickering across his features. Man must be blind as well as stupid. Despite everything, Marion felt a faint flutter of something that might have been humor. "She's beautiful." "She's decorative," Elias corrected. "Like a music box or a piece of fancy glassware. Pretty to look at, useless for anything real." He gestured toward the homestead. "This took strength, vision, character. A man who'd trade all that for a porcelain face." He paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. "He gave up gold for dust." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Gold for dust. It was such a perfect assessment of Thomas's choice that Marion felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite laughter, not quite a sob. "You're kind to say so," she managed, "but kind words don't change reality. I'm alone 30 miles from the nearest town of any size with no family and no prospects. In a week, maybe 2, everyone in Copper Creek will know I've been divorced. Do you know what that means for a woman out here?" Elias's expression darkened. "I know it means a hard road. People can be cruel to women who don't fit their narrow ideas of proper. Cruel doesn't begin to cover it." Marion forced herself to stand, brushing dust from her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. A divorced woman is barely better than a prostitute in most people's eyes. Certainly no better than a servant. I'll be lucky to find work washing dishes at the saloon. "Maybe." Elias studied her thoughtfully. "Or maybe you're stronger than you think you are. Strength doesn't pay bills or put food on the table." "No," he agreed, "but it keeps you breathing when everything else wants you to quit. And breathing's where you start." Marion wanted to argue, to explain why his optimism was naive, why her situation was impossible. But the truth was, she was exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the weight of catastrophic loss. "I should let you get on your way," she said quietly. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Ward, but I'll manage." "I'm sure you will." He moved back toward his horse, but paused with his hand on the saddle. "That mare he left you, she lame on the right front?" Marion blinked, surprised by the question. "She favors it sometimes. Old injury, I think. Probably needs her hoof trimmed and reshod. I've got tools if you want help with it. Won't take more than an hour." It was such a practical, unexpected offer that Marion didn't know how to respond. Charity, she would have refused on principle. But this wasn't charity. It was just a man offering to help with a task that needed doing. Yes, thank you. That would be helpful." Elias nodded, already moving toward the small barn where the mare was stabled. "You got any coffee on? I could use a cup if you're offering." And just like that, as simply as breathing, Marion found herself with company. She retrieved the coffee from the stove, still hot, though bitter from sitting too long, and brought 2 cups out to the barn. Elias had the mare tied and was already examining her hoof with practiced efficiency. "She's been compensating for this a while," he said, not looking up. "Whoever shot her last did a poor job of it, probably rushed. Thomas wasn't patient with that kind of work." The admission slipped out before Marion could stop it. "A man who won't take time with a horse won't take time with much else either." Elias set down the hoof gently and accepted the coffee cup. "Thank you, ma'am." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Elias trimming and filing, Marion fetching tools or holding the mare's halter when she got skittish. It was strange how normal it felt, how the simple rhythm of useful work pushed back against the chaos of the morning. "You planning to stay here?" Elias asked eventually. "On the homestead, I mean." "I don't know." Marion hadn't let herself think that far ahead. Thomas said I should sell it, but she trailed off, looking around at the barn she'd helped build, the land she'd helped clear. This is the only thing I have left that's mine. Then keep it. Elias's tone was matter of fact. Land's worth more than money out here. It's possibility. Possibility doesn't feed a person. No, but a garden does, and you've got a good one started. He finished with the hoof and moved to the next one. You've got water rights too, if I'm not mistaken. That creek runs year-round? Mostly. Sometimes it gets low in late summer. Still better than most folks have. He worked in silence for a moment. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but if you're asking whether it's possible to make it work, yes. I've seen people build lives on less. Marian wanted to believe him, but belief felt dangerous right now, like inviting more disappointment. You don't know me, Mr. Ward. You don't know what I'm capable of. I know you built this place. He gestured around the barn with his file. I know you kept going while your husband was off courting his new future. I know you're still standing after a morning that would have broken most people. He looked up at her directly. That tells me plenty. Something in Marian's chest twisted. Not pain exactly, but recognition. When was the last time someone had seen her work, her effort, and acknowledged it as valuable? Thomas had always taken her contributions for granted, as if the homestead had simply appeared through his will alone, with Marian as nothing more than helpful scenery. I suppose I'll have to figure it out, she said quietly. One way or another. That's the spirit. Elias set down the mare's hoof and straightened, rolling his shoulders. You got a name, ma'am? Seems like I should know it, seeing as we're sharing coffee and horse maintenance. Marian Doyle. She paused, though I suppose that name won't be mine much longer. Name's just a word. What you do with it is what matters. He gathered his tools. Your mare's all set. Should move easier now. What do I owe you? Nothing. He waved off the question. Just being neighborly. We're not neighbors. You said you were passing through. True enough. Elias moved toward his horse, then paused. But I might be passing through regular-like. I've got some business dealings over in Silver City, and this road's the quickest route. He glanced back at her. If that's all right with you. It was a careful offer, leaving her room to refuse without offense. Marian recognized it for what it was. A lifeline extended without strings, help offered without expectation of payment or obligation. It's all right, she said softly. Elias touched his hat brim again in that courteous gesture. Then I'll likely see you again, Miss Marian. Take care of yourself. She watched him ride away, this stranger who'd appeared in her worst moment and offered neither pity nor judgment, just practical help and honest respect. The morning's devastation still sat heavy on her shoulders, but somehow it felt slightly less crushing than it had an hour ago. The papers were still on the porch steps where Thomas had dropped them. Marian picked them up with steady hands and carried them inside. The house felt different now, smaller, quieter, more fully hers. She set the documents on the kitchen table and looked around at the space she'd worked so hard to create. Thomas had called this a mistake, this hardscrabble existence. But as Marian ran her hand along the table she'd sanded smooth, looked at the curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, noticed the neat rows of preserved vegetables on the shelf, evidence of her labor, her skill, her determination, she wondered if maybe the real mistake had been his. He gave up gold for dust. The phrase echoed in her mind as she stared at the divorce papers. A part of her wanted to crumple them, to refuse to sign, to make Thomas's new life as difficult as he'd made hers. But that would require caring what he did, and suddenly, terribly, Marian realized she was already beginning not to. What she cared about was this: the homestead, the land, the life she could build if she was brave enough to try. Thomas had given her that, at least, in his careless cruelty. He'd freed her from the exhausting work of loving someone who'd never truly valued her. She wasn't naive enough to think the road ahead would be easy. Elias was right about that. People would be cruel. A divorced woman in a frontier town faced obstacles and prejudices that could crush someone who wasn't prepared. But Marian had survived 3 years of backbreaking labor, of disappointment, of being taken for granted. She'd survived this morning, which had felt like dying. She could survive what came next. As the sun climbed toward noon, Marian made a pot of beans, fed the chickens, and checked on the garden. The normal rhythms of work settled around her like an old familiar coat. Tomorrow, she'd ride into Copper Creek and face whatever waited there. She'd sign the papers, start looking for work, begin the hard process of building a life that belonged only to her. But today, she'd simply breathe. She'd water her garden and mend the fence and remember that she was still standing. And standing, as Elias Ward had said, was where you started. The ride into Copper Creek the next morning felt longer than the actual 7 miles. Marian sat stiff-backed on the old mare, the divorce papers folded in her pocket like a brand against her skin. The town materialized out of the desert heat gradually. First the outlying shanties and corrals, then the main street with its false-fronted buildings trying desperately to look more substantial than they were. She'd been to Copper Creek dozens of times before, but always as Thomas's wife, always with that invisible shield of respectability that marriage provided. Now, riding in alone with unsigned divorce papers burning a hole in her pocket, she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the merciless sun overhead. The territorial judge's office sat above the general store, accessible by an external staircase that creaked ominously under her boots. Judge Harlan Pierce was a barrel-chested man with magnificent mutton chops and the perpetually irritated expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. He looked up from his paperwork as Marian entered, his eyes narrowing with recognition. Mrs. Doyle. He didn't stand or offer a greeting beyond the bare minimum. I've been expecting you. Judge Pierce. Marian set the papers on his desk with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. My husband said these needed your witness. Ex-husband, soon enough. Pierce unfolded the documents, scanning them with practiced efficiency. Thomas filed his intent 2 weeks ago, cited irreconcilable differences and incompatibility of temperament. He glanced up at her. You contesting any of this? Would it matter if I did? Not particularly. He's got grounds enough, and you're not exactly in a position to argue. The judge's tone wasn't unkind, just blunt with the reality of her situation. Arizona Territory's progressive about these things compared to some places. Divorce is allowed, no scandal required. But that doesn't mean folks won't make their judgments. I'm aware. Marian took the pen he offered. Where do I sign? He pointed to 3 places marked with small pencil X's. Marian signed her name 3 times, watching the ink dry and feeling like she was witnessing her own funeral. With each signature, 3 years of her life reduced to legal fiction, as if the marriage had been nothing more than a clerical error now being corrected. That's done then. Pierce blotted the signatures and filed the papers in a leather folder. You'll be officially divorced in 30 days, once I file this with the territorial office in Tucson. Until then, you're still legally married, though I don't suppose that matters much given the circumstances. No. Marian's voice came out hollow. I don't suppose it does. You got family? Someone who can help you get settled somewhere? The question held a note of genuine concern beneath the gruffness. No family, and I'm not going anywhere. The homestead's mine. Pierce's eyebrows rose. You planning to work that land yourself? Alone? If I have to. That's, He paused, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. That's ambitious. You know there's talk already, don't you? About Thomas and his new woman. About you being left behind. I'm sure there is. Marian stood, smoothing her skirt. People do love their gossip. It's more than gossip when it affects your prospects, Mrs. Doyle. Or Miss... What will you call yourself now? The question caught her off guard. She hadn't thought about it. I suppose I'll go back to my maiden name. Marian Hayes. Miss Hayes, then. Pierce stood as well, his expression softening slightly. I'll be straight with you. You're going to have a hard time in this town. Divorced woman, living alone, folks won't know what to make of you. The decent ones will pity you, and the indecent ones will see opportunity. Then I'll handle both. Marian met his gaze steadily. Is there anything else, Judge? Just this. He pulled a folded newspaper from his desk drawer. Saw this yesterday. Might be worth your consideration. The paper was a week old, from Tucson. Pierce had circled an advertisement in pencil. Teacher wanted for Copper Creek School. Board and basic salary provided. Inquire with town council. Marian stared at the notice, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. I didn't know we had a school. We didn't until last month. Eastern Church Group donated funds to build one. Figure if we're going to be a proper town, we need proper education. Pierce tapped the advertisement. Council's been interviewing candidates, but most don't want to come this far out. You've got education, don't you? I remember Thomas mentioning you'd been to a normal school back in Missouri. 2 years. Marion's mind was racing. But I never completed the program. I left to marry Thomas. 2 years is more than anyone else in this town has, and you can read, write, and cipher, which is all the children really need. Pierce leaned back in his chair. I'm on the council. I could put your name forward if you're interested. It felt like a trap, or maybe a test. Why would you help me? Because you're going to need work, and the school needs a teacher. Seems practical to me. He paused. Also because I watched Thomas Doyle spend 3 years taking credit for work his wife did, and it always stuck in my craw. Man who do that doesn't deserve the loyalty you showed him. Marion didn't know what to say to that. Kindness from unexpected quarters was somehow harder to accept than cruelty. The council meets tomorrow afternoon, Pierce continued. If you want to be considered, be at the town hall at 2 o'clock. Wear something respectable, answer their questions honestly, and try not to look too desperate, even if you are. I'm not desperate. The words came out sharper than intended. Good. Desperation makes people weak, and you can't afford weakness right now. Pierce extended his hand across the desk. 2 o'clock tomorrow, Miss Hayes. Don't be late. Marion shook his hand, feeling the rough calluses of a man who'd worked with more than just paperwork in his life. Thank you, Judge. Don't thank me yet. You still have to convince the rest of the council, and some of them have stronger feelings about propriety than I do. The warning followed Marion down the stairs and onto the street. She stood for a moment in the dusty thoroughfare, watching the town go about its business. A few people glanced her way, some with curiosity, others with the carefully blank expressions of those who knew her circumstances and didn't want to be caught acknowledging them. She needed supplies. The food Thomas had left wouldn't last more than a few weeks, and if she was going to stay on the homestead, she'd need basics: flour, salt, coffee, seeds for late-season planting. The general store was right there, but the thought of walking in and facing Henrietta Walsh's sharp eyes and sharper tongue made Marion's stomach clench. Still, there was no avoiding it. She crossed the street and pushed through the door, the bell jangling overhead like an announcement of her arrival. The store was dim after the bright sunlight, smelling of coffee and leather, and the particular mustiness of dry goods. Henrietta stood behind the counter, weighing out sugar for another customer, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the banker's wife, dressed in a traveling suit that must have cost more than Marion earned in 6 months back when she had earnings. Both women looked up as Marion entered. Mrs. Pritchard's expression went carefully neutral. Henrietta's lips compressed into a thin line of disapproval. "I'll be with you in a moment," Henrietta said, her tone suggesting that moment might be a very long time coming. Marion nodded and moved to examine the shelves, trying to calculate what she could afford with the small amount of money she had left. Thomas had been generous with supplies, but not with cash, probably because cash could be used to leave, while supplies tied her to the homestead. "I heard the most shocking news," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice carrying perfectly in the small space. "About Thomas Doyle and that woman from Santa Fe. Apparently they're already engaged, not even waiting for the divorce to be final. I call it scandalous." "Men have always been able to move on quickly," Henrietta replied, her voice dripping with meaning. "It's the women left behind who suffer the consequences." Marion kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her, reading the same label on a can of peaches over and over while her face burned. "Still, one has to wonder what drove him to such drastic measures," Mrs. Pritchard continued. "A man doesn't just abandon a marriage without reason." "Oh, there's always reason." Henrietta weighed out the last of the sugar with pointed precision. "Sometimes a woman just isn't suited to be a proper wife. Too independent, too mannish in her ways. Men need softness, refinement, not a woman who thinks she can do a man's work." The words hit like physical blows. Marion's hands tightened on the shelf edge, her knuckles going white. "Of course, some women simply can't help their nature," Mrs. Pritchard added. "My husband says Thomas is well rid of her, that he's making a much better match now with a woman who knows her proper place." Something inside Marion snapped. She turned, facing both women directly. "If you're going to talk about me, at least have the courage to do it to my face instead of pretending I'm not standing right here." Henrietta's eyes widened, more in outrage than surprise. Well, I never— Yes, you did. You just did. Marion crossed the floor to stand in front of the counter. My husband left me for a woman with money and connections. That's the truth of it. Not because I was too independent or too mannish, but because he wanted something I couldn't give him, a shortcut to wealth and status. How dare you speak to us this way? Mrs. Pritchard began. How dare I? Marion's voice rose. You're spreading gossip about my private life, making judgments about my character, deciding I deserve to be abandoned, and I'm the one who's out of line? You're divorced. Henrietta spat the word like a curse. Or you will be soon enough. That tells us everything we need to know about your character. It tells you that my husband broke a vow. Marion leaned forward, her voice dropping to something cold and hard. I didn't leave him. He left me. But somehow, in your eyes, that makes me the failure. A good wife would have found a way to keep her husband satisfied, Mrs. Pritchard said primly. Then I guess I wasn't a good wife. Marion straightened. I was just someone who worked herself to exhaustion trying to build a home, who sacrificed everything for a man who saw me as convenient labor. If that's not good enough, then I suppose I deserve your judgment. The sarcasm was thick enough to cut. Henrietta's face flushed red. If you think that attitude will serve you well in this town, I think this town will treat me exactly how it wants to treat me, regardless of my attitude. Marion pulled her short shopping list from her pocket. Now are you going to sell me supplies, or should I take my business elsewhere? There is nowhere else, Henrietta said smugly. Then I suppose you're stuck with me as a customer, and I'm stuck with you as a shopkeeper. We'll both have to learn to tolerate the inconvenience. For a long moment, the two women stared at each other across the counter, a battle of wills playing out in silence. Finally, Henrietta snatched the list from Marion's hand. This will take a few minutes to gather. Her voice was ice. You can wait outside. I'll wait right here. Thank you. Marion didn't move. Mrs. Pritchard gathered her purchases and swept toward the door, pausing next to Marion. You've made an enemy today. That's foolish for a woman in your position. I've made several enemies, apparently. Marion met her gaze evenly. What's one more? The banker's wife left in a flutter of expensive fabric. Henrietta moved through the store with sharp, angry movements, gathering Marion's supplies and tallying the cost with clear resentment. $3.40, she announced. Marion counted out the money carefully, aware that this purchase would take most of what little cash she had. Henrietta wrapped the supplies without a word, her movements jerky with suppressed anger. You think you're so strong, Henrietta said suddenly, standing up for yourself like that. But strength won't feed you when you run out of money. Pride won't keep you warm when winter comes. Maybe not. Marion gathered her packages. But at least I'll face it on my feet instead of on my knees, begging for approval from people who've already decided to hate me. She left before Henrietta could respond, stepping back into the brutal sunlight with her supplies and her anger and the uncomfortable knowledge that she'd probably just made her life significantly harder. But there was also something else, a fierce satisfaction at having finally said what she'd been thinking, at refusing to accept the shame others wanted to heap on her shoulders. The ride back to the homestead was hot and long, giving Marion plenty of time to second-guess her outburst. By the time she reached the property, she'd cataloged at least a dozen ways she could have handled the situation better, been more diplomatic, protected her future prospects. But she'd also realized something important. She was done being small to make other people comfortable. Thomas had wanted a wife who'd diminish herself to make him feel larger. Copper Creek wanted a divorced woman who'd accept their judgment with appropriate shame. Well, they were all going to be disappointed. She was unloading her supplies when she heard the hoofbeats. For one horrible moment, she thought it might be Thomas returning, but the rider who emerged from the trail was Elias Ward, leading his pack horse just as he had 2 days ago. Miss Marion. He touched his hat brim, his eyes taking in her disheveled appearance and the packages scattered around her. Looks like you've had a day of it. You could say that. Marion wiped sweat from her forehead. What brings you back this way so soon? Business in Silver City got postponed. He dismounted with that same easy grace. Thought I'd check on that fence line I noticed was sagging, if you don't mind the company, that is. It was such an obvious excuse that Marion almost smiled. The fence line had been fine, But she was learning to accept help when it was offered, especially from someone who offered it without expecting her gratitude to come with strings attached. "I don't mind." She gestured toward the house. "There's coffee if you want it. Fair warning, though. I just had a confrontation in town that's probably going to make me even more of a pariah than I already am." "Oh?" Elias began helping her carry supplies inside without being asked. "What happened?" Marian told him about Henrietta and Mrs. Pritchard, about the gossip and the judgment and her own flaring temper. As she spoke, she waited for him to tell her she'd been foolish, that she should have been more careful, more strategic. Instead, he laughed. "Good for you. Those types of women thrive on making others feel small. Someone standing up to them probably shocked them clean through. It probably also guaranteed I won't have any friends in this town. Friends who require you to grovel for acceptance aren't worth having." Elias set down a sack of flour. "Besides, you might have more allies than you think. Not everyone in Copper Creek is like Henrietta Walsh. Judge Pierce offered to help me get a teaching position." The words came out uncertainly, as if saying them aloud might make the opportunity disappear. Elias's expression brightened. "The new school? That's perfect. You've got education, haven't you?" "Some, but I'm divorced, Elias, or I will be in 30 days. Do you really think the town council is going to hire a divorced woman to teach their children?" "Only one way to find out." He pulled out a chair at her kitchen table, settling into it as comfortably as if he'd been there 100 times before. "What are they looking for in a teacher?" "I don't know. Someone respectable, I imagine." "You are respectable. Divorce doesn't change that. Tell that to Mrs. Pritchard and Henrietta Walsh." "I don't give a damn what they think, and neither should you." Elias leaned forward, his expression serious. "Listen to me, Marian. You've got two choices here. You can let people like them define who you are and what you deserve, or you can define it yourself. Which is it going to be?" The question hung in the air between them. Marian thought about Thomas, who'd defined her as convenient labor, about Henrietta and Mrs. Pritchard, who wanted to define her as a fallen woman, about all the people who'd be happy to tell her what her life should look like now, what limitations she should accept. "I want the teaching job," she said quietly. "I want to stay on this land. I want to build something that's mine." "Then that's what you'll do." Elias said it with such certainty that Marian almost believed him. They spent the rest of the afternoon working, Elias fixing the fence line that didn't really need fixing while Marian tended her garden and organized her supplies. It was easy, comfortable work, the kind that left room for conversation without requiring it. Every so often, one of them would say something, a comment about the weather, a question about the property, an observation about the land, and the other would respond, building a quiet rhythm of companionship. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold, Elias gathered his tools. "I should head out. There's a camp about 5 miles up the road where I usually stop for the night." "You could stay here." The words were out before Marian could think better of them. "I mean, in the barn. There's clean hay and it's shelter. Seems foolish to ride another 5 miles when you've been working all afternoon." Elias studied her face carefully. "People talk, Marian. Man staying at a divorced woman's homestead. That's the kind of talk that could hurt your chances with the school board." "Let them talk. I'm tired of making decisions based on what people might say." She met his gaze steadily. "Besides, you'd be in the barn, not the house. And you've been nothing but helpful and respectful. If people want to make something ugly out of kindness, that says more about them than us." "All right then." A slow smile spread across Elias's face. "I accept your hospitality, Miss Hayes." The use of her maiden name startled her. She'd forgotten she'd told Judge Pierce to use it. But hearing it from Elias felt right, like reclaiming something that had been lost. She made dinner, beans and cornbread, simple but filling, and they ate on the porch as the desert cooled and the stars began to emerge. Elias told her about his work, how he dealt in horses and cattle, moving between towns and ranches as opportunities arose. It was a solitary life, he admitted, but it suited him. "You ever think about settling down?" Marian asked. "Finding a place of your own?" "Sometimes." He stared out at the darkening landscape. "But I've never found a place that felt like it needed me. Or maybe I never needed a place badly enough to stop moving." He glanced at her. "What about you? This homestead, does it feel like home?" Marion considered the question. It feels like possibility, like something I could make into a home if I had the chance. Then I hope you get that chance. The next afternoon, Marion stood outside the town hall in her best dress, a dark blue cotton she'd sewn herself 3 years ago and had worn maybe a dozen times since. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her boots polished to hide the scuffs. She looked, she hoped, like someone respectable enough to teach children. The town council consisted of 5 men: Judge Pierce, who gave her an encouraging nod; Reverend Samuel Cole, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles; Martin Pritchard, the banker and husband of Eleanor; Jacob Walsh, Henrietta's husband and owner of the general store; and Daniel Crawford, who ran the largest cattle operation in the area. They sat behind a long table like a tribunal, and Marion felt every inch the supplicant as she took the single chair facing them. Miss Hayes, Reverend Cole spoke first, his voice dry and academic. Thank you for coming. We've reviewed your basic information, 2 years at Missouri Normal School. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And you left to marry Thomas Doyle. There it was. The question underneath the question. Yes, sir. A marriage that has now ended. Martin Pritchard's tone was neutral, but Marion could hear his wife's influence in the careful phrasing. My husband filed for divorce. The papers will be final in 30 days. And the reason for this divorce? Jacob Walsh leaned forward. Forgive the indelicate question, but we need to know what kind of person will be instructing our children. Marion's hands tightened in her lap. This was the moment. She could deflect, could give some vague answer about incompatibility, could try to soft-pedal the truth, or she could be honest and risk losing everything. My husband met a woman whose family connections could offer him opportunities I couldn't provide. He chose those opportunities over our marriage. She met each man's gaze in turn. I didn't want the divorce. I didn't cause it, but I'm not going to apologize for it either. The council members exchanged glances. Daniel Crawford, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. That's a hard thing, but it doesn't tell us whether you're suited to teach. No, sir, it doesn't. Marion straightened her shoulders. What tells you that is my education, my experience helping children on my family's farm learn their letters, and my commitment to giving the children of Copper Creek the best foundation I can provide. Experience on a farm isn't the same as running a classroom, Walsh pointed out. No, but it taught me patience, creativity, and how to explain complex ideas in simple terms. Those seem like valuable skills for a teacher. What about discipline? Reverend Cole asked. Can you maintain order? I managed a homestead and kept it running while my husband was absent for weeks at a time. I think I can manage a classroom of children. Judge Pierce was trying very hard not to smile. The others looked less convinced. There's the matter of your reputation, Pritchard said carefully. A teacher must be above reproach. A divorced woman is still a woman capable of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Marion's voice sharpened despite her best intentions. My marital status doesn't affect my ability to teach multiplication tables or proper grammar. But it affects how the community perceives you, Walsh insisted, how parents will feel about entrusting their children to your care. Then perhaps those parents should ask themselves whether they care more about my ability to educate their children or about judging me for circumstances beyond my control. The words came out harder than she'd intended. She saw Pritchard's expression close off, Walsh's lips compress in disapproval. Only Judge Pierce and Daniel Crawford seemed unmoved. Thank you, Miss Hayes, Reverend Cole said. We'll discuss your application and notify you of our decision within the week. It was a dismissal. Marion stood, gave a polite nod, and left before her composure could crack. She made it all the way to her horse before the shaking started. Whether from anger or fear or simple exhaustion, she couldn't tell. She'd failed. She knew it. Her temper, her pride, her refusal to grovel. All of it had cost her the one real opportunity she had. The ride home blurred together, and she found herself at the homestead without quite remembering the journey. Elias was there, working on repairing the chicken coop she'd been meaning to fix for months. He took one look at her face and set down his tools. That bad? I told him the truth. Marion dismounted, her legs unsteady. And I was too proud, too angry. I should have been more what? More willing to accept their judgment, more apologetic for something that wasn't your fault? Elias shook his head. You did right, Marion. Whether they hire you or not, you did right. Right doesn't pay bills. No, but it lets you sleep at night. He moved closer, his voice gentle. And who knows? Maybe they'll surprise you. Marion wanted to believe him, but as the days passed with no word from the council, hope dimmed to a guttering flame. She threw herself into work, expanding the garden, repairing the barn, doing all the 100 small tasks that homestead life required. Elias appeared every few days, always with some plausible excuse, always staying just long enough to help with whatever needed doing before disappearing again. On the 6th day, a rider appeared, one of the town boys carrying an envelope with the town council's seal. Marion's hand shook as she opened it. The letter was brief, formal, and utterly unexpected. Dear Miss Hayes, the Copper Creek Town Council is pleased to offer you the position of school teacher beginning September 1st. Salary of $15 per month plus room and board to be provided. Please report to Reverend Cole to discuss curriculum and classroom preparation. Respectfully, Samuel Cole, Chairman, Education Committee. She read it 3 times, unable to believe what she was seeing. They'd hired her, despite everything, the divorce, her temper, her pride. They'd hired her. Elias found her sitting on the porch steps, the letter in her lap, and tears streaming down her face. Marion, what happened? She held up the letter wordlessly. He read it, and his face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen from him. See? I told you they might surprise you. I don't understand. I was certain they'd reject you? Elias sat down beside her. Maybe some of them wanted to, but obviously not all of them. Later, Marion would learn that Judge Pierce and Daniel Crawford had fought hard for her appointment, arguing that competence mattered more than gossip. She'd learned that Reverend Cole, despite his initial reservations, had been swayed by her honesty. She'd learned that she'd won by a single vote. Walsh and Pritchard opposed, the others in favor. But in that moment, all she knew was that she had a job, a purpose, a chance to build something beyond simple survival. Thank you, she said to Elias, for believing I could do this. I didn't do anything. This was all you. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Now you just have to prove them right. As Marion stood there in the late afternoon sun, holding a letter that represented the first real step toward independence, she felt something shift inside her, a straightening of her spine, a lifting of her head. The road ahead was still uncertain, still difficult, but for the first time since Thomas had driven away with his porcelain bride, Marion felt like she might actually survive this. More than survive. She might actually build something worth having. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple whitewashed building that smelled of fresh pine and possibility. Marion arrived on the first day of September with her arms full of borrowed textbooks and her heart hammering against her ribs. 16 children waited inside, ranging from 6-year-old twins who could barely write their names to 14-year-old Samuel Crawford, Daniel's son, who towered over Marion and looked thoroughly unimpressed at having a woman for a teacher. Good morning, Marion said, setting her books on the desk with more confidence than she felt. My name is Miss Hayes, and I'll be your teacher this year. The children stared back at her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. She recognized some of them. The Walsh children, looking sullen in the front row, clearly coached by their mother about the scandalous divorced woman now in charge of their education. The Pritchard girl, Mary, sat ramrod straight with an expression of careful neutrality that reminded Marion painfully of her mother. But there were others, too. The Morrison twins, dirt poor and thin as rails, watching her with something like hope. Little Anna Chen, whose father ran the laundry, sitting alone in the back corner where the other children had left a careful buffer of empty desks. Tom Reeves, the blacksmith's son, with ink already staining his fingers and a brightness in his eyes that spoke of a mind hungry for knowledge. These children, Marion realized, didn't care about her marital status. They cared whether she could teach them something worth learning. We're going to start, she said, by finding out what each of you already knows. The first weeks were hard in ways Marion hadn't anticipated. The actual teaching came naturally, breaking down arithmetic into understandable pieces, guiding small hands through the formation of letters, watching comprehension dawn on young faces. What she hadn't prepared for was the isolation. The other women in town treated her with cool politeness at best, outright hostility at worst. She ate lunch alone while the children played outside, went home to her empty homestead each evening, lived in a bubble of professional competence that didn't quite mask the loneliness underneath. Elias still came by every week or so, always with some project that needed doing. The relationship had settled into something comfortable and undefined, more than friendship, not quite courtship, a careful dance around feelings neither of them had named aloud. "How's the teaching going?" he asked one October evening, helping her stack firewood for the coming winter. "The children are wonderful, most of them anyway." Marian straightened, rubbing her lower back. "Samuel Crawford still thinks I'm wasting his time, and the Walsh children report everything I say back to their mother, who I'm sure finds it all deeply scandalous." "And the rest?" "The rest make it worthwhile." Marian's expression softened. "Anna Chen is learning to read so fast I can barely keep her in books. The Morrison twins have started staying after school to practice their letters. I think they're scared to go home to an empty house. Tom Reeves asked me yesterday if there were books about building things, about engineering. He wants to be more than a blacksmith." "Sounds like you're making a difference." Elias stacked the last piece of wood. "That's more than most people manage." They were standing close in the gathering twilight, close enough that Marian could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, close enough to notice the way he was looking at her, with something warmer than friendship, something that made her breath catch. "Elias," she started, but he stepped back, the moment breaking like a soap bubble. "Getting late. I should head out. You could stay." The words came easier now, after weeks of his semi-regular visits. "In the barn, like always." "Can't tonight? Got business in Silver City first thing tomorrow." He moved toward his horse. "But I'll be back next week. That shed roof's going to need patching before the winter rains." He was gone before Marian could respond, leaving her standing in the yard with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Disappointment mixed with something more complicated, more dangerous. She was falling for Elias Ward, had been falling for weeks now, and the realization terrified her. The last time she'd trusted a man with her heart, it had ended with divorce papers and public humiliation. But Elias wasn't Thomas. She knew that. Knew. Thomas had been charming and ambitious and ultimately shallow, caring more about appearances than substance. Elias was steady, quiet, the kind of man who showed his character through actions rather than words. Still, knowing something intellectually and trusting it emotionally were different things entirely. The trouble arrived on a cold November morning, announced by the clatter of an expensive carriage on Copper Creek's main street. Marian was in the schoolhouse, helping Anna Chen with a particularly difficult passage in her reader, when she heard the commotion outside. The children rushed to the windows, pressing their faces against the glass. "It's a fancy carriage," one of the Walsh boys shouted, "with real curtains and everything." Marian's stomach dropped even before she saw who emerged. Thomas stepped down first, then turned to help his wife. His new wife, Marian corrected herself, though the divorce wasn't quite final. Genevieve looked even more delicate and porcelain perfect than Marian remembered, dressed in a traveling suit that probably cost more than Marian's annual salary. "Children, back to your seats," Marian said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "Samuel, please continue reading from page 42. But she couldn't focus on Samuel's halting recitation. Through the window, she watched Thomas and Genevieve enter the general store, watched the townspeople gather and whisper, watched her past intrude on the careful present she'd been building. At lunch, she learned why they'd come. Judge Pierce appeared at the schoolhouse, his expression grim. "Miss Hayes, I thought you should know, Thomas Doyle's in town. He's filed a claim with the territorial office." Marian's hand stilled on the sandwich she'd been wrapping. "What kind of claim?" "He's citing an old law, one that dates back to when Arizona was still part of Mexico. According to the statute, certain land titles require a male cosigner or legal guardian for a woman to maintain ownership. He's arguing that since your divorce isn't final and he's relinquishing his claim, the land reverts to territorial control unless you can prove male guardianship." The words took a moment to penetrate. When they did, Marian felt the floor drop out from under her. "That's insane. The land is legally mine. He deeded it to me, and now he's found a loophole to take it back." Pierce's jaw tightened. I've been going through the territorial codes. The law exists, though it hasn't been enforced in years. Most folks thought it was defunct, but technically, it's still on the books. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper. Why would he do this? He didn't want the land. He said it was worthless to him. Apparently, it's not worthless anymore. Pierce pulled a newspaper from his pocket, unfolding it to show an article. There's talk of a railroad spur coming through this area. If it happens, land values will increase significantly. Your homestead sits right where they're proposing to route it. Marion stared at the article, understanding dawning like a sick sunrise. Thomas hadn't come back out of spite or regret. He'd come back because her worthless piece of desert scrubland had suddenly become valuable, and he wanted it back. Can he do this? Legally? If he pushes it through the territorial courts, maybe. The law's vague enough that it could go either way. Pierce folded the newspaper. But fighting it would cost money you don't have and time you can't afford. He's got resources now, his wife's family money. He can drag this out until you're bankrupted by legal fees. So what do I do? Marion heard the desperation in her own voice and hated it. You need a male co-signer, a husband, or legal guardian who can validate your claim. Pierce hesitated. Or you sell the land before he can take it through legal channels. Sell it to who? Thomas? Probably. He'd buy it for pennies on the dollar, then turn around and sell it to the railroad for a fortune. Marion stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, children played in the yard, their laughter incongruous with the catastrophe unfolding inside. This is what he does. He takes. He took 3 years of my labor, my hope, my trust, and now he wants to take the one thing I have left. I'm sorry, Miss Hayes, truly. Pierce moved toward the door. You've got maybe 2 weeks before he files the formal suit. After that, your options become very limited. He left Marion standing in the empty schoolhouse, surrounded by the evidence of the life she'd been building. Children's primers, carefully written assignments, a world globe she'd bought with her own money. All of it now threatened by a man who'd already taken everything once and apparently wasn't satisfied. That evening, she rode home in a fog of rage and fear. The homestead looked different now, not like possibility, but like a target, something to be fought over and eventually lost. She was feeding the chickens when she heard the second set of hoofbeats. For one horrible moment, she thought it might be Thomas come to gloat. Instead, it was Genevieve who rounded the barn, riding side saddle on a delicate mare that looked as out of place in the desert as its rider. Miss Hayes! Genevieve's voice was cultured, Eastern, with the careful diction of expensive finishing schools. I hope I'm not intruding. That depends on why you're here. Marion scattered the last of the chicken feed, not bothering to hide her hostility. Come to inspect the property your husband's trying to steal? Actually, I came to warn you. Genevieve dismounted with practiced grace, though Marion noticed she winced slightly. Her expensive boots weren't designed for actual riding. May we speak privately? Against her better judgment, Marion gestured toward the house. Inside, she poured 2 cups of coffee while Genevieve perched uncomfortably on the edge of a chair, looking around the simple space with barely concealed distaste. This is where you lived? With Thomas? This is where I worked while Thomas had ideas. Marion set down the coffee harder than necessary. What do you want, Mrs. Doyle? To tell you that I'm sorry. Genevieve wrapped her hands around the cup. And to warn you that my husband, that Thomas, is going to fight for this land with every resource at his disposal. I gathered that much from Judge Pierce. You don't understand. Genevieve looked up, and Marion was startled to see something like desperation in her eyes. My father insisted on this. When he found out about the railroad, he ordered Thomas to reclaim the property by any means necessary. Thomas tried to refuse, but my father threatened to dissolve their partnership, to withdraw his support entirely. And Thomas chose money over decency. How shocking! The sarcasm dripped like acid. He's not... Genevieve stopped, seemed to reconsider. You're right. He chose money. He'll always choose money. I'm beginning to understand that. There was something in her tone, disillusionment maybe, or the first cracks in her porcelain facade. Marion studied her more carefully. Up close, Genevieve looked tired. Her perfect appearance couldn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. Why are you telling me this? Because I thought you should know what you're facing. Thomas will use every legal trick, every connection my family has. He'll drag you through court, destroy your reputation further, make your life hell until you surrender. Genevieve set down her cup. And because I suspect I made a terrible mistake in marrying him, and watching him destroy you feels like watching my own future. The honesty was unexpected, disarming. Marion sat down across from her. What do you want me to do with this information? Fight back if you can, or run if you can't. Genevieve stood, smoothing her skirts. But don't do what I did. Don't let him make you feel like you have no choices just because all your choices are hard. She left as quietly as she'd come, leaving Marion more confused than ever. Thomas's own wife had come to warn her, had essentially admitted their marriage was already showing cracks. There should have been satisfaction in that, some vindication. Instead, Marion just felt hollow. Elias arrived 2 days later to find Marion in the barn, systematically checking every beam and board as if cataloging what she was about to lose. He took one look at her face and didn't bother with pleasantries. What happened? She told him everything, Thomas's claim, the railroad, the impossible choice between fighting a legal battle she couldn't afford and surrendering the only thing she owned. When she finished, Elias was quiet for a long moment. Marry me. The words were so unexpected that Marion actually laughed. What? Marry me. Today, tomorrow, as soon as we can get Judge Pierce to do it. Elias moved closer. That law requires a male co-signer. A husband counts. If we marry, your claim becomes uncontestable. Elias, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious, like. His expression was steady, certain. I know it's not romantic. I know you deserve better than a marriage of convenience, but it's a solution. It's insane, Marion backed away. We barely know each other. I know you're strong and stubborn and too proud for your own good. I know you work harder than any person I've ever met. I know you care about those kids you teach and this land you're trying to hold on to. He paused. And I know that losing this place would break something in you that maybe wouldn't heal. The words hit too close to home. Marion turned away, gripping the stall door. I can't marry you just to save my land. That's not fair to you. What if I told you I'm not just doing it for you? She looked back at him. Elias was watching her with an expression she'd never quite seen before. Vulnerable, open, a little bit scared. I'm 43 years old, he said quietly. I've spent 20 years moving from place to place, never settling, never letting myself want anything permanent because wanting things means risking loss. And then I met you, standing in the dirt crying over a husband who wasn't worth your tears, and something in me just stopped running. Elias, I'm not saying I'm in love with you. I don't know if I am. But I care about you, Marion. I admire you. And I think. He stopped, started again. I think we could build something good together if you wanted to try. Marion's throat tightened. It would be so easy to say yes, to let Elias solve this problem, to accept the shelter of a marriage that came with kindness instead of cruelty. But the last time she'd married for practical reasons, for a future someone else had painted in pretty words, it had ended in abandonment and humiliation. I need time to think, she whispered. You don't have time. Thomas is filing his suit in less than 2 weeks. Then I need what time I have. She met his gaze. I won't marry anyone out of fear, Elias, not again. If I say yes, if it has to be because I choose it freely, not because I'm being backed into a corner. Something flickered across his face. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding. All right, but Marion, when your back's against the wall and your choices run out, remember that I'm offering this freely. No strings, no expectations beyond what we both agree to. You wouldn't owe me anything except honesty. He left her standing in the barn with a proposal hanging between them like an unspoken promise. That night, Marion couldn't sleep. She paced the house, made coffee she didn't drink, tried to sort through the tangle of her thoughts. Marrying Elias made practical sense. He was a good man, honest and hardworking, someone who'd shown her nothing but respect. He didn't want to own her or diminish her. He'd made that clear through months of careful friendship. A marriage to him would be different from her marriage to Thomas in every way that mattered, but practical sense wasn't the same as certainty. Marion had learned that lesson the hard way. and rushing into another marriage, even to a better man, felt like repeating a mistake rather than learning from it. 3 days later, Thomas came to the schoolhouse. He arrived at the end of the school day, just as Marion was helping the Morrison twins with their arithmetic. The children looked up as he entered, their chatter dying into uncertain silence. Thomas had always been good at commanding a room. "Mr. Doyle," Marion kept her voice level. "The school day is over. If you need to speak with me, you can wait outside." "This won't take long." Thomas surveyed the classroom with barely concealed contempt. "Playing teacher now, Marion? How quaint." "I said outside." She turned to the children. "You're all dismissed. I'll see you tomorrow." The students gathered their things quickly, casting nervous glances between Marion and this stranger who radiated hostility. Anna Chen was the last to leave, pausing at the door with a worried expression. Marion gave her what she hoped was a reassuring smile. When they were alone, Thomas moved to her desk, picking up one of the children's compositions and reading it with a mocking expression. "Charming. Tell me, does plain school marm pay enough to cover your expenses, or are you barely scraping by?" "What do you want, Thomas?" "I want you to be reasonable." He set down the paper. "The land claim is going to go through whether you fight it or not. My father-in-law's lawyers are very good, and the law's on my side. You'll lose, Marion, and in the process you'll rack up legal fees you can't afford and destroy what little reputation you have left. So you've come to offer me what? A settlement? $500. That's more than fair for land you couldn't work properly anyway." He leaned against the desk. "Take it. Buy yourself a little house in town, continue playing teacher, live whatever small life you can manage. It's more than you'd get if this goes to court." $500. It was probably a tenth of what the land would be worth with the railroad coming through. Marion felt rage building in her chest like steam in a kettle. "You took 3 years of my life," she said quietly. "You took my labor, my trust, everything I gave you freely. And now you want to take the one thing I have left and act like you're doing me a favor. I'm offering you a way out. That's more kindness than you deserve." "Kindness?" Marion's voice rose. "You abandoned me, humiliated me, left me with nothing, and you think offering me pennies for my own land is kindness? I left you the land when I could have left you with nothing. I gave you a chance to start over. It's not my fault you couldn't make something of yourself." The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. This was the man she'd married, the man she'd loved, or thought she'd loved. Had he always been like this? Or had success with Genevieve's family money simply revealed what had been lurking underneath all along? "Get out!" Her voice shook. "Get out of my classroom." "Think about my offer, Marion. $500 and a clean break, or months of legal hell that ends with you losing anyway." Thomas moved toward the door. "You have until Monday to decide." He left her trembling with rage and something dangerously close to despair. $500 or legal ruin. Those were her choices, according to Thomas. Surrender or destruction. But he'd forgotten something. He'd forgotten that Marion Hayes had already survived destruction once. She'd survived his abandonment, the town's judgment, the grinding loneliness of building a life alone. She'd survived because she was stronger than he'd ever given her credit for. She rode straight to Elias's camp that evening, finding him by his fire with a plate of beans and a tin cup of coffee. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding. "I've thought about your offer," Marion said without preamble, "and I have some conditions." Elias set down his plate. "I'm listening. First, this would be a real marriage in the eyes of the law, but we both go into it with open eyes. No pretending it's something it's not." "Agreed." "Second, I keep teaching. I keep my own money. I make my own decisions about how I live my life. I wouldn't expect anything else. Third," she paused, the hardest condition catching in her throat, "if you meet someone else, someone you actually love, someone who can give you what I can't, we end this cleanly. I won't trap you the way Thomas trapped me." Elias stood, moving closer. "Marion, I'm not Thomas. I'm not going to get bored with you or trade you in for a better model." "You don't know that. You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise to be honest with you, always." He reached for her hand carefully, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. "I've got a condition too." "What?" "We give this a real chance, not just a legal arrangement, but a partnership. We see if what we've been building these past months could become something more. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. Because I think it could, Marion. I think we could be good together, if we're both willing to try. Marion looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and weathered, hers ink-stained and work-worn. Two people who'd lived hard lives, offering each other something neither had expected to find. It wasn't the romantic proposal of storybooks, but maybe that was better. Maybe practical partnership built on mutual respect was stronger than pretty promises that crumbled under pressure. All right, she whispered. We'll try. Is that a yes? That's a yes. She looked up at him. When? Tomorrow. We'll ride to Judge Pierce first thing, get married before Thomas can file his claim. Elias squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll file our own claim, showing legal mail co-signature. By the time Thomas realizes what happened, it'll be too late. He'll be furious. Let him be. A hard smile crossed Elias's face. Man wants to play legal games. He'd better be ready to lose. They rode back to the homestead together in the darkness, not quite touching but close enough that Marion could feel the warmth of Elias beside her. At the house, he started to move toward the barn, then paused. Marion? I know this isn't how you imagined getting married again. If you want to wait, if you need more time, no more time. She was surprised by the certainty in her own voice. I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions. Tomorrow, we do this. He nodded, touched his hat brim in that familiar gesture, and disappeared into the barn. Marion stood in the doorway of her house, her home, and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, not yet, but the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, she could have this. A home, a purpose, a partner who saw her as an equal rather than a subordinate. It wasn't what she dreamed of as a young woman. But dreams changed when you lived through their destruction and emerged on the other side. What she wanted now wasn't romance or grand passion. It was steadiness, honesty. Someone who showed up when they said they would and kept their promises even when it was hard. Elias had been showing up for months now. That had to count for something. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of November day that hinted at the winter to come. Marion dressed in her best dress again, the same blue cotton she'd worn to the school board interview, and tried not to think about the fact that she was about to marry a man she'd known for less than 4 months. Elias met her outside, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and vest, his hair slicked back with water. He'd shaved, she noticed, and the unfamiliar smoothness of his jaw made him look younger, almost nervous. Ready? He asked. As I'll ever be. They rode to town in silence, the morning sun throwing long shadows across the desert. Copper Creek was just waking up when they arrived, shopkeepers opening shutters and sweeping stoops. A few people stared as Marion and Elias dismounted outside Judge Pierce's office, but no one said anything. Pierce was at his desk, reviewing papers with his morning coffee. He looked up as they entered, his eyebrows rising. Miss Hayes, Mr. Ward, this is unexpected. We need you to perform a marriage, Elias said without preamble. This morning, if possible. Pierce set down his coffee slowly. A marriage. That's right. Marion stepped forward. I assume you've heard about Thomas Doyle's land claim. I have. Then you know why we're here. She met his gaze steadily. A husband can serve as legal co-signer. We'd like to be married before Thomas files his suit. Understanding dawned across Pierce's face, followed by something that might have been approval. That's actually quite clever. Does Doyle know about this? No one knows except us, and now you, Elias said. We'd like to keep it that way until the marriage is registered. Pierce leaned back in his chair, studying them both. I have to ask, are you doing this freely, both of you? Because a marriage entered into under duress isn't legal. I'm choosing this, Marion said firmly. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Mr. Ward? Same. Elias's voice was steady. I'm asking Miss Hayes to marry me of my own free will, and she's accepting under the same conditions. Pierce nodded slowly. Then I'll need 2 witnesses. Give me 10 minutes to find them. He returned with Reverend Cole and Daniel Crawford, both looking curious and slightly bemused. The ceremony itself was brief, almost perfunctory. A few words about commitment and partnership. A simple exchange of vows. Marian heard herself say, "I do," and felt Elias's hand steady on hers as he repeated the same words. "By the power vested in me by the Arizona Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Pierce signed the marriage certificate with a flourish. "Mr. Ward, you may kiss your bride." It was the first moment that felt real. Elias leaned forward carefully, giving Marian time to pull away. She didn't. The kiss was brief, chaste, his lips warm against hers. When he pulled back, something had shifted in his eyes, a quiet joy that made Marian's chest tighten. "Congratulations," Pierce said, handing them the certificate. "Now, let's get this registered before Thomas Doyle knows what hit him." Within the hour, the marriage was officially recorded with the territorial office. Elias signed as co-holder of Marian's land claim, his signature bold and clear next to hers. It was done. Legal, binding, uncontestable. They emerged from the courthouse into bright morning sunlight. Marian felt strange, untethered, like she'd just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to discover whether she could fly or would simply fall. "Mrs. Ward," Elias said softly, testing out the name. "That's going to take some getting used to." Marian looked down at the marriage certificate in her hands. "We really did this. We really did." He moved closer. "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet." She looked up at him. "Ask me again in a week." Elias smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Fair enough. For now, what do you say we go tell Thomas Doyle his scheme just fell apart?" They found Thomas at the hotel, taking breakfast with Genevieve in the dining room that catered to travelers with money to spend. He looked up as Marian and Elias entered, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion when he saw them together. "Marian, I wasn't expecting to see you until Monday." His gaze flicked to Elias, dismissive. "And you've brought company." "My husband, actually." Marian set the marriage certificate on the table between Thomas's coffee cup and plate of eggs. "Elias Ward. We were married this morning." The color drained from Thomas's face as he snatched up the certificate, his eyes scanning the official signatures and seals. Genevieve leaned over to read it as well, her expression carefully neutral, though something flickered in her eyes that might have been relief. "This is—" Thomas's voice came out strangled. "You can't have what? Gotten married?" Marian kept her voice pleasant, though her heart was racing. "I assure you it's completely legal. Judge Pierce performed the ceremony himself. As you can see, my husband has signed as co-holder of the land claim, which means your little legal maneuver just became worthless." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the floor. Several other diners looked over with interest. "You did this to spite me." "I did this to protect what's mine." Marian met his furious gaze without flinching. "You wanted to steal my land using an archaic law. I found a legal way to stop you. That's not spite. That's self-defense." "You don't even know this man." Thomas jabbed a finger toward Elias. "You married a stranger just to—" "I know him better than I ever knew you." The words came out harder than Marian intended, but they were true. "Elias has shown me more respect and kindness in 4 months than you showed me in 3 years. So yes, I married him. Gladly." Elias had remained silent until now, but he stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Marian and Thomas. "I think this conversation is over. The land belongs to my wife, legally and uncontestably. Whatever claim you thought you had just evaporated." "This isn't finished." Thomas's face was red now, his hands clenched into fists. "My father-in-law has connections, resources. We can challenge this marriage, prove it's a sham. On what grounds?" Elias's voice stayed level, but there was steel underneath. "We're legally married. The certificate's been registered with the territorial office. You can challenge it if you want, but you'll lose, and you'll look like a fool doing it." Genevieve stood as well, placing a hand on Thomas's arm. "Let it go." "Let it go?" Thomas turned on her. "That land is worth I know what it's worth, and I know when we've lost." Genevieve's voice was quiet but firm. She looked at Marian, and something passed between them, understanding perhaps, or recognition of a shared experience with the same man. "Congratulations on your marriage, Miss Hayes. I hope it brings you more happiness than mine has brought me." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Thomas stared at his wife, something ugly crossing his face. Genevieve, we're leaving. She gathered her gloves in reticule. Today. I'll have the hotel send our things to the station. To Marion, she added softly, he gave up gold for dust. I'm beginning to understand what that cowboy meant. She swept from the dining room with the grace of someone who'd learned to make dramatic exits in finishing school. Thomas stood frozen, caught between fury at Marion and shock at his wife's defection. Finally, he grabbed the marriage certificate, crumpling it in his fist. Keep your worthless patch of desert. It'll break you eventually, with or without me. He threw the crumpled paper at Marion's feet. You think you've won something, but you've just chained yourself to another man who'll disappoint you. Maybe. Marion didn't bend to pick up the certificate. But at least I chose him freely. That's more than I can say about choosing you. Thomas stormed out, leaving them standing in a dining room full of people who were no longer even pretending not to stare. Elias bent and retrieved the crumpled certificate, smoothing it carefully. We should probably get a new copy of this, he said quietly. Marion started to laugh. She couldn't help it. The absurdity of the whole situation, the look on Thomas's face, Genevieve's quiet rebellion, all of it bubbled up in slightly hysterical laughter. Elias looked at her with concern, then amusement, and finally joined in. They walked out of the hotel together, still laughing, leaving behind the wreckage of Thomas's schemes and the beginning of their own strange partnership. The ride back to the homestead was different from the morning's tense journey. Marion felt lighter somehow, as if confronting Thomas had lifted a weight she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. Elias rode beside her in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing over as if to make sure she was real. So, he said eventually, we're married. We're married, Marion agreed. The reality of it was starting to sink in now that the immediate crisis had passed. I suppose we should talk about practical arrangements. Practical arrangements. Elias's mouth quirked. That's one way to phrase it. Well, we can't keep pretending you live in the barn. Marion's cheeks warmed. People already know we're married. If you keep sleeping out there, they'll assume the marriage is... that we're not a real marriage? Elias finished gently. Marion, I meant what I said yesterday. I want to give this a real chance, but that has to be at a pace you're comfortable with. If you need time before we... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Before we share living quarters, in all the ways married people typically do, then we take that time. The kindness in his voice made Marion's throat tight. I just need to know what you're expecting. I'm expecting honesty, partnership, a chance to see if what we've started can grow into something lasting. He pulled his horse to a stop, turning to face her directly. I'm not expecting you to fall into bed with me just because we signed papers. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the landscape. The rough scrubland, the distant mountains, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. You asked me once if I'd ever thought about settling down. The truth is, I'd stopped letting myself think about it. After my wife died, Marion's breath caught. You were married before? 15 years ago. Sarah. She died of fever while I was away on a cattle drive. His voice was steady but distant, talking about old pain that had scarred over but never fully healed. I blame myself for not being there. Spent years moving around because staying in one place felt like inviting that kind of loss again. I'm sorry. I didn't know. No reason you should. Elias met her eyes. But it's why I understand what you're feeling. Why I know that trust isn't something you just decide to give. It's something that has to be earned, day by day, choice by choice. They reached the homestead as the sun climbed toward noon. Marion dismounted, suddenly aware that everything had changed and nothing had changed. The house looked the same. The barn, the garden, the chickens scratching in the yard, all exactly as they'd been this morning. But she was married now. Elias Ward was her husband, not just the helpful cowboy who drifted through every week. I should move my things in, Elias said, reading her uncertainty. Unless you'd rather I wait. No, you're right. People will talk if you stay in the barn. Marion took a breath, trying to project confidence she didn't quite feel. The house has 2 rooms, the bedroom and the main room. You can take the bedroom. I'll make up a bed out here by the stove. Marion, I'm not taking your bedroom. You're a foot taller than me and spent half your life sleeping on the ground. The bedroom has an actual bed. You're taking it. She said it firmly, brooking no argument. At least until things are different. Elias studied her face, then nodded. All right, but I'm building you a proper bed frame for out here. No wife of mine is sleeping on a pile of blankets on the floor. The words wife of mine sent a strange flutter through Marion's chest. She busied herself with unsaddling her horse to hide her reaction. They spent the rest of the day in practical tasks, Elias moving his few belongings from his camp, Marion rearranging the main room to accommodate a sleeping area, both of them carefully navigating this new reality they'd created. It was awkward and strange and occasionally uncomfortable, but it was also oddly domestic in a way that Marion hadn't expected. By evening, they'd fallen into an unspoken routine. Elias saw to the horses while Marion started dinner. They ate together at the kitchen table, the conversation flowing easier than it had any right to given the circumstances. Afterward, Elias washed the dishes while Marion graded papers from her students, and it all felt almost normal. Almost. When it came time to sleep, the awkwardness returned. Elias retreated to the bedroom with a quiet, "Good night," closing the door to give Marion privacy. She changed into her nightdress and settled onto the makeshift bed by the stove, staring up at the ceiling and trying not to think about the fact that there was a man sleeping in the next room. Her husband sleeping in the next room. She'd thought marriage to Thomas had been strange at first, but at least then she'd had the excuse of youth and infatuation to smooth over the uncomfortable moments. This was different, a practical arrangement between two people who barely knew each other, trying to build something real out of necessity and hope. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Marion continued teaching, riding into town each morning and returning each evening to find Elias working on some project or another. He was building her that bed frame he'd promised, along with fixing a dozen other things around the homestead that she'd learned to live with broken. The property was slowly transforming under his steady attention. The barn got a new roof, the fence line was reinforced, the chicken coop expanded. "You don't have to do all this," Marion said one evening, watching him plane board smooth for a new set of shelves. "I know." Elias didn't look up from his work. "But we're partners now. Your problems are my problems. Your home is my home." "Is it?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. "Your home, I mean, or are you just passing through with legal documents now?" Elias set down the plane, giving her his full attention. "Where else would I go? Everything I want is right here." The sincerity in his voice made Marion's chest ache. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this time would be different. But 3 years with Thomas had taught her that men could say beautiful things without meaning them. As if reading her thoughts, Elias added, "I know you don't fully trust me yet. That's all right. I'll just keep showing up every day until you do." And he did. Week after week, Elias was simply there, steady, reliable, doing exactly what he said he would do. He never pushed for more than Marion was ready to give, never complained about their strange sleeping arrangements, never made her feel like she owed him anything beyond basic partnership. It was during these weeks that Marion began to notice the small things. The way Elias always made sure there was coffee ready when she woke up, how he'd leave wildflowers on the table sometimes, claiming he'd found them while checking the fence line. The careful way he asked about her day at school, actually listening to her stories about the children and offering thoughtful observations. The townspeople noticed too. Marion could feel their eyes when she and Elias came to town together, could hear the whispers about the divorced woman who'd married so quickly. But there was less judgment than she'd expected and more curiosity. A marriage that had started as a legal maneuver was beginning to look like something real, and that confused people's simple narratives about fallen women and their deserved fates. It was Henrietta Walsh who finally confronted her about it, cornering Marion at the general store on a cold December morning. "I suppose you think you're very clever," Henrietta said, her voice sharp with resentment, "trapping that cowboy into marriage to save your skin." Marion set down the flowers she'd been examining. "I didn't trap anyone, Mrs. Walsh. Elias proposed of his own free will. Because he felt sorry for you, because you were desperate and pathetic and he's too kind-hearted to say no. Or because he saw something worth building a life with." Marian kept her voice level despite the anger rising in her chest. I know that's hard for you to imagine, a man choosing me freely, but it happened. It won't last. Henrietta leaned closer, her words venomous. Men like that don't settle down. He'll get bored with playing house and move on, just like Thomas did. And then you'll be twice divorced and completely ruined. The words hit harder than Marian wanted to admit, because they echoed her own deepest fears. What if Elias did get bored? What if this whole thing was just his version of charity, a good deed that would eventually feel like a burden? But then she remembered the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like she was something precious that he was still amazed to have found. She remembered his patience, his kindness, the steady accumulation of small acts that added up to something larger than either of them had planned. Maybe you're right, Marian said quietly. Maybe it won't last, but at least I'm building something worth fighting for instead of tearing down everyone else's happiness because I'm miserable in my own marriage. Henrietta's face went white, then red. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Everyone in this town knows Jacob Walsh spends more time in the saloon than he does at home. Everyone knows you're bitter and lonely and taking it out on anyone who has a chance at something better. Marian picked up her flower. I feel sorry for you, Mrs. Walsh, truly, but I'm done letting your misery dictate my life. She paid for her supplies and left before Henrietta could respond, her hand shaking but her head held high. Outside, she found Elias waiting by the wagon, his expression concerned. Trouble? Henrietta Walsh being Henrietta Walsh. Marian loaded her supplies. She thinks you'll leave me, get bored and move on. Do you think that? Elias's voice was quiet. Marian climbed up onto the wagon seat before answering. I'm trying not to. You've given me no reason to doubt you, but Thomas gave me no reason to doubt him either until the day he did. Elias swung up beside her, taking the reins but not immediately urging the horses forward. I'm not Thomas. I'll keep saying that until you believe it. I want to believe it. The admission felt dangerous, vulnerable. I'm just scared. Of what? Of letting myself care about you and then losing you anyway. Of being wrong about this, about us. She looked at him directly. Of waking up one day and realizing I've made the same mistake twice. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. Then he set down the reins and turned to face her fully. Marian, I can't promise I'll never disappoint you. I'm human. I'll make mistakes, say the wrong thing, probably frustrate you more times than I can count. But I can promise that I won't abandon you. I won't betray your trust. And I won't wake up one day and decide you're not worth the effort. How can you know that? Because I spent 15 years alone after Sarah died, convinced I was better off not risking my heart again. And then I met you. And I realized that being safe isn't the same as being alive. He reached for her hand carefully. You make me want to be alive again, Marian. Not just existing, but actually building a life worth living. That's not something I'm going to walk away from. Marian felt tears prickling at her eyes. She'd been so focused on protecting herself from potential hurt that she hadn't fully considered what Elias might be risking too. He'd lost someone he loved, spent years running from that pain, and was now choosing to stop running. For her. With her. I'm not very good at this, she whispered. At trusting. At letting someone in. Neither am I. Elias's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. But maybe we can figure it out together. They sat there in front of the general store, hands clasped, while Copper Creek went about its business around them. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, but it felt important. A small moment of connection that meant more than a dozen pretty speeches. That night, after dinner and evening chores, they sat together by the fire. Elias was working on a piece of leather tack that needed mending. Marian was reading, though she found her attention drifting more to the man across from her than to the words on the page. Can I ask you something? She said eventually. Always. What did you mean when you said everything you want is here? What do you want, Elias? He set down his work, considering the question. Simple things, mostly. A home that's mine. Work that matters. Someone to share it all with. He paused. Children, maybe, if that's something you'd want. The mention of children sent a jolt through Marian. She hadn't let herself think that far ahead. hadn't considered that this marriage might eventually include more than just the two of them. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I never thought much about it with Thomas. He always said we'd wait until we were more established, until the homestead was profitable. It felt like one more thing that was always in the future, never quite real. And now? Now I don't know what I want. Except—" She stopped, trying to articulate something she barely understood herself. "Except maybe to stop being afraid all the time, to trust that good things can actually last." Elias moved from his chair to sit beside her on the floor near the fire. "What would help? What would make you less afraid?" It was such a simple question, but no one had ever asked it before. Thomas had never cared what she needed to feel secure. He'd expected her to adapt to his plans, his timeline, his vision of their future. "Time," Marion said slowly, "and honesty. Just keep being who you are, keep showing up, keep being patient with me when I'm difficult." "That's easy enough." Elias smiled. "You're not that difficult." "You say that now. Wait until winter really sets in, and I'm snowed in for days with nothing to do but overthink everything. Then I'll distract you." He said it lightly, but there was warmth in his eyes that made Marion's breath catch. They were sitting close now, close enough that Marion could see the flecks of darker green in his eyes, could count the silver threads in his hair. Close enough that when Elias leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, she found herself leaning forward to meet him instead. The kiss was different from their brief wedding day contact, deeper, more honest, carrying weeks of accumulated tension and tentative trust. Elias's hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle but sure. Marion's eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time in months, she let herself simply feel without analyzing or protecting or planning 3 steps ahead. When they pulled apart, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "Is this all right?" "Yes." Marion's voice came out breathless. "More than all right." They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, letting the reality of their connection settle around them. Eventually, Elias pulled back, his expression serious. "I need you to know something. I'm in this for the long term, Marion. Not because I have to be, but because I want to be. Because when I look at you, I see my future. And it's better than anything I imagined for myself." The words settled into Marion's chest like a promise. Not the empty promises Thomas had made, all flash and no substance, but the kind of promise that was backed by consistent action and genuine care. "I'm starting to believe you," she whispered. "I'm starting to believe this could actually work." "It will work. We'll make it work." Elias stood, offering his hand to help her up. "For now, though, you should get some sleep. School tomorrow, and those children need their teacher sharp." Marion let him pull her to her feet, but didn't immediately move toward her makeshift bed. Instead, she stood on her toes and kissed him again. Brief, spontaneous, a gesture of gratitude and growing affection that surprised them both. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For seeing me when everyone else looked through me, for being patient, for being you." Elias's smile could have lit the whole desert. "Go to sleep, Marion. Before I do something foolish like ask you to reconsider our sleeping arrangements." She laughed, a real laugh, and retreated to her bed by the stove. But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to Elias settle in the bedroom, Marion found herself thinking that maybe, eventually, reconsidering those arrangements wouldn't be foolish at all. The next few weeks brought a subtle shift in their relationship. The kisses became more frequent, the touches more familiar. They developed rituals, morning coffee together, evening conversations by the fire, comfortable silences that didn't need filling. Marion found herself looking forward to coming home in a way she never had with Thomas. Found herself thinking about Elias during the school day and smiling at private memories. It was in mid-December that Judge Pierce appeared at the homestead with news. Elias was out checking the fence line, so Marion received him alone. "Miss Hayes, Mrs. Ward, I should say." Pierce tipped his hat. "I thought you should know that Thomas Doyle's legal claim has been officially dismissed. The territorial office confirmed your marriage is legitimate and your land title is secure. He can't touch it." Relief flooded through Marion. "And Thomas? Where is he?" "Gone. Left for Santa Fe 3 days ago with his wife. Word is he's taking a position with his father-in-law's business. Won't be back this way." Pierce's expression softened. "You won." completely. I won, Marion repeated, testing the words. They felt strange, almost surreal. For months she'd been fighting just to survive, to hold on to the bare minimum. The idea that she'd actually triumphed, that she'd outmaneuvered Thomas and secured her future, seemed too good to be true. Your husband's a good man, Pierce said. I've been asking around about him. Got a solid reputation as honest and fair in his dealings. You chose well. I did, didn't I? Marion smiled. Though I'll admit, at the time it felt less like choosing and more like drowning and grabbing the nearest lifeline. Sometimes that's how the best choices happen, when we're too desperate to overthink them. Pierce moved toward his horse. One more thing. The town council's been impressed with your teaching. They're planning to build a real schoolhouse next spring, something bigger. They want you to continue. After Pierce left, Marion stood in the yard, letting the magnitude of it all sink in. She had a home, legally secured, a job that valued her, a husband who treated her like a partner rather than property. 6 months ago, she'd been sitting in the dirt crying over Thomas's betrayal. Now she was standing tall, having built something real from the wreckage of her first marriage. When Elias returned at sunset, she was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and news that changed everything. Thomas's claim has been dismissed, she said as he approached. It's over. We won. Elias's face split into a wide grin. Of course we won. Never doubted it for a second. Liar. You were as worried as I was. All right, maybe a little worried. He climbed the porch steps and pulled her into his arms without hesitation. But we still won, together. Marion leaned into the embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and sage and hard work. I couldn't have done it without you. You know that, right? And I wouldn't have wanted to do it without you. Elias pulled back just enough to look at her face. You're the bravest person I know, Marion Ward. Don't ever forget that. The use of her new name sent warmth spreading through her chest. She was Marion Ward now, not Marion Doyle, not even Marion Hayes. A new name for a new life, one she was choosing actively rather than having it chosen for her. Elias? She looked up at him. I think maybe I'd like to reconsider those sleeping arrangements we talked about. His eyes widened slightly. You're sure? I'm sure that I trust you. I'm sure that this marriage feels more real than my first one ever did. I'm sure that I want to stop living like we're roommates and start living like we're actually married. She took a breath. If you still want that. If I still... Marion, I've wanted that since the day we got married. I've just been waiting for you to be ready. I'm ready. In saying it aloud, Marion realized it was true. The fear was still there, would probably always be there in some small measure, but it was outweighed now by trust, by growing affection, by the steady evidence of Elias's character accumulated over weeks and months. That night, they moved Marion's things into the bedroom they would now share. It felt momentous and ordinary at the same time, just a practical rearrangement of living space that happened to represent a complete transformation in their relationship. As they settled into bed together for the first time, Elias pulled Marion close, wrapping his arms around her with a protectiveness that felt like safety rather than possession. I love you, he said quietly. I should have said it before, but I love you, Marion. Not because you needed saving or because we got married for practical reasons. I love you because you're fierce and stubborn and impossibly strong, because you rebuild broken things instead of throwing them away, because you saw me and chose me too. Marion felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Happy tears this time, the kind that came from being seen and valued exactly as she was. I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it. Not scared anymore? Terrified, she admitted, but doing it anyway. Elias kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise. And Marion kissed him back, pouring into it all the trust and hope and tentative joy she'd been holding back for months. This was what partnership was supposed to feel like. 2 people choosing each other every day, building something together that was stronger than what either could build alone. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows and the desert night pressed close. But inside, in the warmth of their shared bed, Marion finally understood what it meant to be home. Winter settled over the Arizona territory with surprising gentleness that year. bringing cool nights and crisp mornings, but little of the harsh weather Marion had been warned about. The homestead transformed under Elias's steady attention, and their combined efforts, what had once been a struggling patch of desert was becoming something that actually resembled a working ranch. Marion woke on Christmas morning to find Elias already up, stoking the fire and making coffee. She watched him from the bed for a moment, still adjusting to the reality of sharing her life so completely with another person. He moved through the space with quiet confidence, completely at ease in what had become their home together. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. Elias turned, his face lighting up when he saw her awake. "Merry Christmas. I was trying to let you sleep in. It's your one day off from the school." "I'm awake now." Marion wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and patted over to him. He handed her a cup of coffee, and she curled into his side, both of them watching the fire catch and grow. "Did you ever think 4 months ago when you proposed that we'd actually be here? Like this?" "I hoped." Elias pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But I didn't want to assume. You were so scared, Marion, so determined not to let anyone close again." "I was an idiot." "You were protecting yourself. There's a difference." He set down his coffee and moved to the small pine tree he'd cut and brought inside a week earlier. From behind it, he pulled a wrapped package. "I made you something." Marion took the package with trembling hands, surprised by the sudden thickness in her throat. Thomas had never made her anything. He'd bought expensive gifts when he remembered holidays at all, but they'd always felt impersonal, like obligations fulfilled rather than genuine expressions of care. Inside the wrapping was a wooden box, beautifully crafted with dovetailed corners and a smooth finish. The lid was carved with an intricate design of desert flowers, the same wildflowers Elias occasionally left on the table. "It's for your things," Elias said, suddenly looking uncertain. "Your papers from teaching, or letters, or whatever you want to keep safe. I noticed you didn't have anywhere secure to store personal items." Marion ran her fingers over the carved flowers, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. He'd made this with his own hands, had spent hours, probably weeks, working on it, thinking about what she might need or want. It was the most thoughtful gift she'd ever received. "It's perfect," she finally managed. "Elias, it's absolutely perfect." "There's something inside." Marion opened the box and found a folded piece of paper. She recognized Elias's careful handwriting immediately. He'd been practicing his letters in the evenings, embarrassed that his education hadn't extended much beyond basic reading and arithmetic. "My dearest Marion," the letter began, "I am not good with fancy words, but I wanted you to have something written down that you could keep. Something to read when you doubt yourself or when the hard days make you forget how far you've come. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You took betrayal and turned it into determination. You took nothing and built everything. You gave me a reason to stop running and start building a life worth having. I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of you. With all my love, Elias." The tears came then, hot and fast. Marion set down the box carefully and turned into Elias's arms, letting herself cry against his chest while he held her and murmured reassurances. "I didn't mean to make you sad," he said, sounding worried. "I'm not sad. Marion pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm happy, completely, impossibly happy, and I'm not used to that yet." Elias smiled, relief washing over his features. "Then we'll just have to keep practicing until you get used to it." They spent Christmas Day quietly together. A simple meal, a long walk across their land, hours of conversation by the fire. It was nothing like the elaborate celebrations Marion remembered from her childhood, but it was exactly what she needed. Peace, companionship, the steady certainty of being exactly where she belonged. It was in early January that Marion first suspected she might be pregnant. She didn't say anything at first, unwilling to mention it until she was certain, unwilling to create expectations that might be disappointed. But as the weeks passed and her suspicions strengthened, she found herself both terrified and thrilled in equal measure. She was grading papers one evening when Elias noticed her distraction. "You've been staring at the same assignment for 10 minutes, he observed. "Either young Tom Reeves has written something truly profound or something else is on your mind." Marion set down the paper. They'd promised each other honesty, and she couldn't keep this secret even if she wanted to. "I think I might be pregnant." Elias went very still. You think? I'm fairly certain. It's still early, but the signs are... I'm late, and I've been feeling strange in the mornings. She twisted her hands together. I know we never really talked about children, not seriously. If this is too soon, if you're not ready... Not ready? Elias crossed to her in 3 long strides, pulling her up and into his arms. Marian, are you joking? This is... He pulled back to look at her face, his own expression filled with wonder. We're going to have a child? Maybe. Probably. Marian searched his face for any hint of doubt or regret. You're really happy about this? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Elias's hands moved to her still flat stomach with a kind of reverence. A child. Our child. Marian, this is everything I never let myself hope for. The joy in his voice made Marian's own fears seem smaller. She'd been worried about the practicalities, how she'd manage teaching while pregnant, whether they could afford another mouth to feed, what the town would say about a baby arriving so quickly after their marriage. But looking at Elias's face, seeing the pure, uncomplicated happiness there, those concerns felt manageable rather than overwhelming. We should probably wait to tell people, she said, just until I'm further along and we're sure everything is all right. Whatever you want. Elias kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her lips. But I'm going to have a hard time not shouting it from the rooftops. They kept the secret for another month, until Marian could no longer hide the changes in her body or the morning sickness that sometimes made teaching difficult. She told the school board in February, expecting resistance or judgment about continuing to teach while expecting a child. Instead, Reverend Cole smiled warmly. Congratulations, Mrs. Ward. That's wonderful news. We'll need to start thinking about finding your replacement for the fall term, of course, but there's no reason you can't continue through the spring. Even Henrietta Walsh, who'd been coldly polite since their confrontation, thawed slightly when she heard the news. She cornered Marian at the general store with an expression that was almost sympathetic. I was wrong about you, Henrietta said abruptly. About your marriage. I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. You and Mr. Ward seemed genuinely happy together. That's more than most people get. It was the closest thing to an apology Marian was likely to receive, and she accepted it with grace. Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. That means more than you might think. The townspeople's gradual acceptance felt like its own kind of victory. Marian had arrived in Copper Creek as a scandalous, divorced woman, barely tolerated and widely judged. Now she was Mrs. Ward, the respected schoolteacher expecting her first child, a woman who'd turned catastrophe into triumph through sheer determination and well-chosen partnership. Spring arrived with a riot of desert wildflowers and news that made the whole town buzz with excitement. The railroad was indeed coming through, just as the rumors had promised, and land values were skyrocketing. Elias came home one evening with an offer from a railroad representative, a staggering sum for their property, enough to set them up comfortably anywhere they chose. What do you think? He asked Marian, showing her the figure on the official letter. Marian looked around their home, the house they'd improved together, the land they'd worked to build into something profitable, the garden already sprouting with spring vegetables. I think this is where we belong. This is what we fought for. Even if it means turning down enough money to make life significantly easier? Easier isn't always better. Marian took his hand, placing it on her growing belly where the baby had just started to show. Besides, this land is part of our child's heritage now, part of our family's story. I don't want to sell that. Elias's expression softened. Then we keep it. We build our life here, raise our family here, let that railroad run right through someone else's property. They declined the offer, to the railroad representative's genuine shock. But Marian didn't regret the decision. Some things couldn't be measured in money. The satisfaction of building something that lasted, the pride of standing on land that was fully and legally theirs, the knowledge that they'd fought for this and won. It was in late March when Daniel Crawford approached Elias with a different kind of proposition. I'm expanding my cattle operation, Crawford said, the 2 men standing at the fence line that separated their properties. I need good men who know horses and can handle themselves in rough country. You interested in steady work? Partnership even, if things go well. Elias glanced at Marion, who was working in the garden within earshot. She paused, listening. "That's generous," Elias said carefully. "But I should talk to my wife first." "Smart man," Crawford chuckled. "Take your time. Offer stands whenever you're ready." That evening, they discussed it over dinner. The partnership would mean reliable income, security for their growing family, a chance for Elias to do work he genuinely enjoyed rather than just scraping by with odd jobs. "What do you want to do?" Marion asked. "I want whatever's best for us, for all three of us." Elias looked at her belly. The ranch work would be steady, but it'd mean being away sometimes. Days at a time during roundup season. "I can handle a few days alone. I managed before you came along, didn't I?" Marion smiled. "Besides, if it's work you'd enjoy and it provides stability for our family, then it seems like an obvious choice." Elias accepted Crawford's offer the next day, and within a week had proved himself valuable enough that Crawford was already talking about making the partnership official. The steady income meant they could start thinking about expanding the house, building proper structures for livestock, maybe even hiring help during busy seasons. But it was the smaller victories that Marion treasured most. Anna Chen brought her father to meet Marion one afternoon, the usually reserved Mr. Chen speaking in careful English about how his daughter's reading had improved under Marion's teaching. The Morrison twins showed up one Sunday with their mother, who pressed a jar of preserves into Marion's hands and thanked her for giving her boys hope for something beyond the poverty they'd been born into. Even Samuel Crawford, who'd spent the first months of school treating Marion with barely concealed contempt, approached her on the last day of the term with something like respect. "My pa says you're the best thing that happened to this town in 10 years, Samuel said awkwardly. "Says you proved that being proper isn't the same as being good, and being good is what really matters." Marion felt her eyes mist over. "Thank you, Samuel. That means a great deal coming from you." The school term ended in May, and Marion found herself with summer stretching ahead, time to prepare for the baby, to work on the homestead, to simply exist without the constant pressure of proving herself worthy. She was in the garden one warm June morning when she heard the wagon approaching. Her first thought was that it might be Elias coming home early from Crawford's ranch, but the wagon that appeared was too fine, the horses too well bred. Marion's stomach dropped when she recognized Genevieve Doyle in the driver's seat, alone this time, her expensive traveling suit replaced with something simpler and more practical. Marion stood slowly, one hand on her back, the other instinctively protective over her swollen belly. Genevieve climbed down from the wagon with none of her previous delicacy, moving with purpose. "Mrs. Ward, I hope I'm not intruding." Genevieve's voice was different somehow, steadier, more certain. "That depends on why you're here." Marion kept her voice neutral. "I assume Thomas doesn't know about this visit." "Thomas and I are divorced." Genevieve said it flatly, without emotion. "The papers were finalized last month. I'm going by my maiden name now, Genevieve Hartwell." Marion blinked, genuinely surprised. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't be. It's the best decision I've made in years." Genevieve looked around the homestead, taking in the improvements, the obvious signs of prosperity and care. "I came to apologize, and to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For showing me what it looks like when someone refuses to accept less than they deserve." Genevieve moved closer. "I watched you fight for this place, for your dignity, for your right to build the life you wanted. And I realized I'd spent my entire life accepting whatever was decided for me. By my father, by society's expectations, by Thomas." "What happened?" Marion asked gently. "I woke up one morning and realized I was miserable. Thomas was miserable. We were making each other miserable, trying to live up to an image neither of us particularly wanted." Genevieve's expression twisted. "My father was furious when I filed for divorce, cut me off completely. So I took the settlement Thomas gave me. He was happy enough to be rid of me, and I'm starting over." "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. Maybe California. Maybe back east to relatives who might take me in despite the scandal." Genevieve smiled, and for the first time it looked genuine rather than practiced. "But wherever I go, I'll be making my own choices. That's something I learned from watching you." Marion felt an unexpected kinship with this woman who'd once represented everything she'd lost. They were both divorced, both rebuilding, both learning to navigate a world that didn't quite know what to do with women who chose independence over social approval. "I wish you well, Miss Hartwell," Marion said sincerely. "Truly. And I wish you happiness. Real happiness, not the performative kind." Genevieve glanced at Marion's belly. "It looks like you found it." "I have. More than I thought possible." They stood together in the afternoon sun for a moment longer, two women whose lives had intersected in the strangest of ways, before Genevieve climbed back into her wagon. "One more thing," Genevieve called as she gathered the reins. "Thomas asked me to tell you, if I ever saw you, that he was sorry. For what it's worth." "It's not worth much," Marion said honestly, "but thank you for delivering the message anyway." She watched Genevieve drive away, feeling the weight of that chapter of her life finally, completely closing. Thomas was remarried and divorced again, his grand plans apparently falling apart just as spectacularly as he'd built them. There should have been satisfaction in that, some vindication. Instead, Marion just felt grateful that she'd escaped when she did, that his betrayal had pushed her towards something infinitely better. Elias came home that evening to find Marion on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. He settled beside her, pulling her close. "Good day?" he asked. "Strange day." Genevieve came by. "She and Thomas are divorced." Elias whistled low. "That didn't last long." "No. She thanked me. Can you believe that? Said watching me fight for this place taught her to fight for herself." Marion shook her head. "The whole thing was surreal." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." Marion turned to look at him. "It just made me realize how far I've come. A year ago, I was sitting in this yard crying over a man who wasn't worth my tears. Now I'm married to someone who actually values me, expecting a child, part of a community that respects me. It's almost too much to believe." "Believe it." Elias's hand found hers. "You earned every bit of this, Marion. You fought for it, built it from nothing. This isn't luck or chance. This is you refusing to give up even when everything was working against you." The baby kicked then, strong enough that Elias felt it through Marion's dress. His face lit up with that wonder that still appeared every time he felt their child move. "Not much longer now," Marion said softly. "Are you scared?" "Terrified, but also ready." She placed her hand over his on her belly. "We can do this, can't we? Build a good life for this child?" "We're already doing it." Elias gestured around at everything they'd created. "This is exactly the kind of life worth giving a child, one built on honesty, hard work, and people choosing each other every single day." Their daughter was born on a sweltering July afternoon, arriving fast and furious after a labor that left Marion exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. Elias had wanted to fetch the doctor from Tucson, but the baby had other plans, entering the world with the help of a local midwife and her own fierce determination. "She has your stubbornness," Elias said, cradling the red-faced, squalling infant with a mixture of terror and awe. Already insisting on doing things her own way. Marion laughed weakly from the bed. "Good. She'll need it in this world." They named her Sarah, after Elias's first wife, a gesture that Marion offered, and Elias accepted with tears in his eyes. It felt right, honoring the past while building toward the future, acknowledging that love didn't diminish by being shared but multiplied. The town rallied around them in ways Marion hadn't expected. Henrietta Walsh brought by baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Mrs. Pritchard, who'd barely spoken to Marion in months, arrived with a beautifully knitted blanket. Even Judge Pierce stopped by with a silver rattle, gruffly congratulating them before hurrying away, as if embarrassed by his own sentimentality. It was Daniel Crawford who brought the most surprising gift, the deed to 10 additional acres adjoining their property. "Consider it a partnership bonus," Crawford said, waving off Elias's protests. "Your work's been worth 3 times what I'm paying you. Besides, you'll need the space if you're planning to expand your own herd." "I don't know what to say," Elias managed. "Say you'll keep being the kind of man who treats his wife like a partner instead of property, and raises his daughter to be as strong as her mother." Crawford looked at Marion, who was holding Sarah against her shoulder. This town needs more people like you two. People who build instead of tear down. After he left, Marion and Elias stood together in the doorway, looking out at land that was fully, legally, completely theirs. More land than Marion had ever dreamed of owning. He threw away gold for dust, Marion murmured, remembering Elias's words from that first terrible day. What's that? Something you said the day Thomas left me. You said he gave up gold for dust. Marion looked up at her husband. You were right. He had everything here, a home, a partner, a chance to build something real, and he threw it away for the illusion of something better. His loss was my gain. Elias pressed a kiss to her temple. I got the gold. I got you. Summer faded into fall, and Marion adjusted to the rhythms of motherhood with the same determination she'd brought to everything else. She'd resigned from teaching, at least temporarily, but the town had already approached her about returning when Sarah was older. They'd even offered to let her bring the baby to school if needed, an unprecedented accommodation that spoke to how much her work was valued. On a cool October morning, exactly a year after she'd first accepted the teaching position, Marion stood in the yard watching Elias work with a young horse. Sarah was strapped to her chest in a sling, sleeping peacefully against her mother's heartbeat. The homestead was thriving now. They had a small herd of cattle, chickens that actually produced eggs, a garden bursting with late-season vegetables. The house had been expanded, the barn rebuilt, every structure solid and well-maintained. This was what she'd been fighting for all along, Marion realized. Not just survival, not just keeping Thomas from stealing what was hers. She'd been fighting for the right to build a life on her own terms, to be valued for who she was rather than diminished for who she wasn't. And she'd won. Completely, thoroughly won. Elias looked over and caught her watching him. His face broke into that smile that still made her heart skip, the one that said she was precious to him, that he couldn't quite believe his luck in finding her. What are you thinking about? He called. How far we've come, how much has changed. Any regrets? Marion looked down at her sleeping daughter, then around at the land they'd built together, then back at the man who'd appeared in her darkest moment and offered not rescue but partnership. Not a single one. That evening, after Sarah was asleep in her cradle and the chores were done, Marion and Elias sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. The desert night was cool and clear, the kind of evening that made you feel small and significant all at once. I've been thinking, Elias said, his arm around Marion's shoulders, about expanding the ranch. With the extra acreage from Crawford and the railroad bringing more business to the area, we could really build something substantial. Maybe even hire a few hands, grow the cattle operation into something that could support multiple families. An empire, Marion said with a smile, remembering Thomas's grand plans. A legacy, Elias corrected. Something to pass down to Sarah, and maybe to her brothers and sisters, if we're blessed with more children. More children? Marion raised her eyebrows. Should we maybe let this one sleep through the night before we start planning the next? Fair point, Elias laughed. But the principle stands. We've built something good here, Marion. Something worth expanding and protecting and passing on. Marion rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the solid warmth of his presence. A year ago, she'd been alone, abandoned, certain that her life was effectively over at 26. Now she had everything she'd stopped letting herself dream about. A partner who loved her, a child who depended on her, a home that was truly hers, work that mattered, a community that respected her. You know what the best part is? She said softly. What's that? I chose this. Not all of it. Thomas leaving wasn't my choice. But everything that came after, every good thing we've built, that was me making decisions and taking risks and refusing to let fear or judgment stop me. Marion looked up at him. And I chose you. Every day I keep choosing you. And I keep choosing you right back. Elias pulled her closer. Best decision I ever made, stopping at this homestead that day. Best decision of my entire life. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, two people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, broken enough to understand pain, strong enough to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Inside, Sarah stirred and whimpered. Marion started to rise, but Elias waved her back down. I'll get her. You rest. Marian watched through the window as Elias lifted their daughter from the cradle, cradling her against his broad chest and pacing the room with gentle, rocking steps. He was singing something. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see his lips moving, could see Sarah settling back into sleep against her father's shoulder. This, Marian thought, this was what home felt like. Not a place exactly, though the homestead mattered. Not just security, though they finally had that too. Home was this, watching the man you loved care for the child you'd made together, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also knowing you'd face them as partners, building your life one choice at a time. The orchard Elias had planted in the spring was beginning to take root, small trees that would need years of care before they produced fruit. But Marian could imagine it already. Sarah playing beneath the branches, picking apples with dirt-stained hands, learning the patient work of growing things. Maybe other children too, a whole brood of them, filling the homestead with laughter and life. It was a future worth fighting for, worth every hard moment, every fear overcome, every risk taken. Marian stood and moved inside, wrapping her arms around Elias and their daughter, creating a circle of warmth in the cool desert night. Elias kissed the top of her head. Sarah made a small, contented sound, and Marian felt something settle deep in her soul, a bone-deep certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. Thomas had walked away from gold to chase dust. But in doing so, he'd unknowingly led Marian to something infinitely more valuable, a life built on truth, partnership, and the kind of love that showed up every single day and chose to stay. The betrayal that had broken her world open had also created space for something better to grow. And Marian Ward, standing in her home with her family in her arms, and her future stretching bright before her, understood finally and completely that she wouldn't change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. This was her life. Chosen, fought for, earned, and it was worth more than any amount of gold dust could ever be.